Thanks, and thanks for coming. This is a topic that has many different levels to it. And Todd, I hope I do you justice. I always worry when somebody says, oh, this is a really interesting topic. And then, anyway. So if you're bored, it's my fault. Anyway. But the levels of this, so I titled this talk, Should Society Put a Price Tag on Nature, right? The emphasis here is on the, we could also do this talk at a technical level, like, how would we do this? And, come over to the Applied Economics Department and we'll go through great lengths about how to do things. Anyway, if you're interested in that, we can talk about that. But I think there's a really important question here. The train is moving. The thing that I've been really amazed on in conservation communities and environmental communities is this push really towards economics and integrating economics and ecology. That's part of what I do, but in general, sort of the conservation community really thinking that we need to make, in a way, the economic case. So I'm going to try to unpack that in this talk. But first I want to give you some context. As I said, I think history is really, in a way, that the train is pulling out of the station on making economic and financial arguments about conservation or environment in general. And so I want to give you a little bit of kind of historical context about that. And then I'll get into some specifics. And then we'll have plenty of time, I hope, for questions, because I think this is a topic that many people are interested in, and there's lots of viewpoints on this. Okay, so my own history on this, I've been interested, obviously, since coming to Minnesota. I have a position which is a joint position between economics and ecology, so trying to span this space. But for the last decade or so, I've been heavily involved in project called the Natural Capital Project. Some of you I know are familiar with this. It's a partnership between two academic institutions, so Ione here at the University of Minnesota and the Woods Institute at Stanford, and two very large conservation organizations, the Nature Conservancy and WWF. And I'll probably also give you a little bit of flavor kind of from the Nature Conservancy side. So I serve on the board of the Nature Conservancy. And a lot of the tension in kind of recent arguments have actually kind of gone through the Nature Conservancy. It's kind of an interesting window on things. Okay, so I want to, there was a very nice article in Science, and Bonnie, thank you for pointing this out. I think you were the one who gave this around to our lab group. But Georgina Mace, in a recent article in Science, summarized kind of where the conservation community has been and kind of what trends there have been. So, there's sort of the earlier period where, nature for itself, the intrinsic value of nature. We conserve biodiversity because species are valuable in and of themselves, and we don't have to go to the economists and talk about how valuable they are. It's just they're inherently valuable. And then kind of putting on top of that, oh, but people are actually doing a lot to nature. We need to put up fences. We need to have protected areas. So we need to protect nature from people, or quote this, nature despite people. Well, anybody who looks at protected areas and knows about conservation, right now we protect 10, 12% of the surface of the land area. So you've got 88, 90% of the land area. Outside of that, if you're really going to do conservation, if you're really going to think about ecosystems and how they function and how people and nature function together, you have to be thinking about the areas outside of protected areas. And even if you were only interested in protected areas, you have to think about how do you make the case for why we need to have more protected areas, why you would want to put a fence up and tell people they can't farm or they can't cut trees or whatever it might be. So there was a real shift in the conservation community, kind of early 2000s, but I think it's really been later than that. Push towards these ideas of ecosystem services, the idea that nature provides benefits to people. And that was a move then away from like individual species to thinking about ecosystem functions. How do nutrients flow through ecosystems? How do they store carbon? How do they contribute to water quality? And a move towards environmental economics. So this kind of shift from nature despite people to nature for people was an important pivot in conservation community, but I think more broadly in the environmental space. And then more recently, there's also been arguably, or Mesa argues that there is now kind of a balance, people and nature. We think about integrating social science and natural science. To me, I actually think of the real split as being here, that there's sort of a intrinsic value of nature. There's a focus or bringing people into the mix here, okay? And I view these things as sort of, in our lab group, we had a discussion about this, and I said, well, in order to really do the ecosystems approach or nature for people approach, I have to understand the ecosystem. I have to understand nature, or otherwise I can't do this. So, of course, this is people and nature. It can't be separated. Okay, well, the specific story that I want to tell is back, actually just a few months ago. So in May of this year, there was a report or a story in the New Yorker, and it focused on the Nature Conservancy, and particularly it focused on Mark Tursick, who's the president and CEO of the Nature Conservancy. And Mark, he was on campus a few years ago. Some of you may have interacted with him there. Very great, he's a friend, but he's also a really powerful leader of the Nature Conservancy, and he had a vision. He comes from a financial background. He came from Goldman Sachs. He was really interested in conservation questions, had the chance in 2008 to become the head of the Nature Conservancy. Nature Conservancy, frankly, took a gamble. Coming from Goldman Sachs, that is not your typical bio for somebody running a conservation organization, right? And he is full square into, we have to make the case of it's nature and people. These are valuable, the ecosystem services and the natural capital. He has written a book called Nature's Fortune, to give you an idea. And another central player here is Peter Kariva, and I'll just give you a quote from Peter from an article that he wrote, Conservation in the Anthropocene. The point is, you can't, there is no such thing as nature separate from people. We're so dominant, we're shaping the planet. So instead of pursuing the protection of biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, going back to that intrinsic value or earlier, conservation should seek to enhance those natural systems that benefit the widest number of people, especially the poor, right? So here is a very clear statement of the new conservation and not doing the old conservation. Well, nothing ever goes away easily. And in fact, the point of this, one of the points of this New Yorker article was to talk about the conflicts and tensions between new conservation and old conservation. And so Michael Soule, arguably the founder of conservation biology, Reed Noss, another prominent conservation biologist, Stuart Pym, they were part of a team of people that was really upset with the Nature Conservancy, and Peter Kariva in particular, feeling like the Nature Conservancy had abandoned the style of conservation that they had pursued throughout their careers. There was a very interesting, I don't know if any of you have read the New Yorker. It's a really nice article to read, especially on these topics, but there was a meeting. So Tursick said, we have to get all these people together. We can't fight in-house. There's too many other battles to run. The conservationists can't be shooting at each other. So there was a meeting at the Nature Conservancy with Tursick, Kariva, these people, plus a few others, and I got to sit in the room. It was actually one of the most interesting 2 hours I've ever spent. Buy me a beer sometime and I'll tell you a little bit more. Fortunately for me, I didn't show up in the New Yorker article, so. But anyway, I don't know if you can see well, but Mark here looks a little concerned or like A little bit angry. Anyway, this is part of the problems that he faces, is trying to reconcile these different groups. You know, in the meeting there was general agreement. I mean, these are people who do conservation. They all agree on 90% of what they are, but there is a different emphasis. And the real schism here is, how do we think about making the case for conservation? Is this conservation for its own sake, or is this conservation because it is valuable to people? And if it's the latter, then you have to decide, well, how valuable is it? How do we show that saving nature improves human well-being? And that's really at the guts of this argument about should we value nature, at least in my view. Okay, so I'm going to run you through a couple of arguments for valuing nature, and then I'm going to run through some arguments prominent critics of this approach, and I will be up front. This one actually makes more sense to me, the valuing arguments for valuing nature, so I'm going to speak more in first person, and I can do this. I will try to do my best about the counter arguments, and there's some very good ones, but I will probably, as you'll notice, I'll use more of other people's words because it's not as much coming from me. Okay, back in 2005, there was a report put out, worked on by over 1,300 scientists worldwide, called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Some of you in the room actually may have been involved. And what was really interesting to me, so I was involved, but kind of on the side, but it was primarily natural scientists, ecologists who were interested in taking the pulse of the planet. What's the status and trends of ecosystems and biodiversity? What came out of this, and you can see it in the title, the synthesis, ecosystems and human well-being, right? So this was firmly in the new camp of we need to show how this links to people, why people need to care. Since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the efforts at trying to value nature show how nature and people interact, or why they're inextricably linked, and our well-being is inextricably linked to nature, have really taken off. I want to give you one chart from the from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This is a summary table, and I don't expect you or care if you read all these. These are different ecosystem services, so provision of fresh water, provision of food and fiber, climate regulation, and so forth. So each column, each row is a different ecosystem service. And the arrows here, the triangles, so if it's down like this, it means the trend kind of globally or roughly was down. That ecosystem service was in decline. And if it was up, it was increasing, and the plus minus meant a little of both. There was no clear trend. What was really interesting was they said a majority of the ecosystem services, the things that really impact on people's well-being, are headed down. Okay? But not all. And what I want to do here is, if you look at, I'll put a red circle around the ones that are going up. And in particular, let's see if this works. Okay, so the ones that are going up, crops, livestock, aquaculture. Those are not the typical things like water regulation or disease regulation. These are things that people get paid to do, right? Farmers get paid for their crops, their livestock. People get paid for aquaculture. But sadly, we don't typically pay people for fresh water provision or for flood regulation or for climate regulation. The one interesting exception here actually is carbon sequestration. So outside of the tropics, we have had in general forest regrowth, even though oftentimes people are not paid for it. So that's kind of the one exception. But otherwise, it's when things are commodities, people protect them. When they're not, they don't. And that's you know, kind of, I wish that were not true, but just looking at the data, that's what we seem to see. Okay, there is, following on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, there's been a huge push in this direction. I'm just giving you several recent efforts and reports. So this is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This is a book from the Natural Capital Project, which I'm part of, that, on how to do natural capital ecosystem services. the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, an NRC report, National Research Council report, UK National Ecosystem Assessment from the United Nations, Inclusive Wealth Report. You get the idea. There's a lot of activity going on in this space now. There's also a lot of activity, and increasingly so, in the private, and so in the corporate space. So here again are some, or international organizations space, some of the different groups that are working to try to, like here, how can we actually do national income accounting in a way, national income and wealth accounting in a way that actually brings in the value of natural capital, the value of ecosystem services. World Resources Institute, corporate ecosystems reporting, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, and others are trying to say, well, how would we actually have corporate accounting sheets actually represent the values of nature and how the company, through its actions, is increasing or decreasing, quote, the natural capital in the way that they have to keep track of other assets that the company affects or owns. Okay, I'll give you two examples specifically from Minnesota very quickly. This is work that I and others here have done. One that we were very interested in looking at land use, and the point here, what we were trying to do is to say, we can have all kinds of different land use in Minnesota. We ought to be thinking carefully about the full set of consequences of those alternative land use choices. So skipping to the kind of punchline of the paper, so I'm obviously ignoring all the how and the nitty-gritty, and Derek, who's I think in the room, will know that there was a lot of nitty-gritty involved in this, right, Derek? Yes. So all of that we're skipping over, but the point here is the following. So if I look at, quote, the typical bottom line down here, this just is what goes through markets now, right? So we had 6 different alternatives. That's what these columns are. Down here, this is what landowners get paid for right now. And if you look at, well, of these 6 alternatives, which one's the best for them, it's this one right here, okay? So, but if you go up a line and you say, well, we really ought to be thinking about what the value of nature is in here. So in particular, we're going to add in the value of carbon sequestration, and we're going to also add in the value of water quality improvements into this. Now again, there's lots of details on how we did this, and I can go into it if you're interested, but the point that I'm using, or why I wanted to use this particular graph, was when you add in some of these values for nature and you look at the rankings of alternatives, now the thing which had been most preferred before, just looking through the market lens, is least preferred. So from a social standpoint, if you were really taking account of all of the consequences, all of the benefits and the costs of these alternatives, you go, well, this is the least preferred alternative. We should be doing something else like this one, or the conservation scenario, or the forest expansion scenario. A lot of them are much better. This one is in fact the worst. Okay, so the point is, if we don't do this, we're systematically getting wrong decisions. We're robbing nature, but that's also robbing people. We're throwing away benefits. I'll report just on another effort that we did recently in Minnesota. What are the health and environmental costs of electricity generation in Minnesota? And the point here was, as you can see, we know that like when you burn coal, for example, yes, you get electricity, but you also get a lot of emissions into the air. So you get greenhouse gas emissions. You also get emissions of sulfur dioxide and NOx and other things which are precursors to particulate matter, which have health impacts. So if you were thinking about, like the Public Utilities Commission actually has to do in Minnesota, to take into account what are the full costs of electricity generation, should we put in a renewable electricity generating plant, or a coal-fired power plant, or a natural gas-fired power plant? Let's not just look at what Excel pays for, but let's look at the full set of costs that society incurs. And so we actually, in this report, I won't claim that we have the right set of numbers. This was, in a way, a back-of-the-envelope calculation, but our task at the point was to tell the Public Utilities Commission that basically setting a value of 0 on the health costs was not the right answer. So it wasn't that hard of a hurdle for us to jump over. But right now, actually, this is an ongoing procedure. The Public Utilities Commission, the Department of Commerce, the Pollution Control Agency are in the process now of hiring a consultant to figure out what are the health and environmental costs of electricity generation and how should those be factored into decisions that the state makes in terms of licensing power plants. Okay, so giving you 2 examples, one land use, one here it's power plant design, or what kind of power electricity system are we going to have. Cases where it's vitally important to have the kinds of evidence and the numbers, I feel, into the system in order to make better decisions. Okay, not everybody feels this way, right? So many people wish that this would just go away and that we would just have nice nature. Okay, so I will give you several people who have been very eloquent on this through the decades. One is David Ehrenfeld, a biologist from Rutgers, who was a contributor to E.O. Wilson's book, who was in 1988, which was a summary of a very a panel discussion at the Smithsonian that brought together lots of leading thinkers. And basically what Ehrenfeld said was, the title of his article in this was, "Why Put a Value on Biodiversity?" In the long run, basing our conservation strategy on economic value of biodiversity will only make things worse. If I were one of the many exploiters and destroyers of biodiversity, I would like nothing better than to have my opponents, the conservationists, bogged down over issues of valuation. For biological diversity, value is nothing more and nothing less. No cottage industry of evaluators is needed. Okay? There is a very clear statement when coming back to what I was talking about initially. Intrinsic value of nature. Why are we even having this discussion about the market value of nature or what economists would call even non-market value? Why are we having this discussion? It just is we should be protecting biodiversity. A more recent argument, and perhaps a little more nuanced, was a paper that came out in Nature in 2006 by Douglas and Colley, provocatively titled "Selling Out on Nature." The backstory to this is that Macaulay was a grad student at Stanford, and he heard a lecture by Gretchen Daly, another of the people who's on the Natural Capital Project with whom I work closely. And he was so outraged by this talk about valuing nature that he went out and he said, I have to counter this. And so he wrote this piece for Nature magazine saying why this was not a good strategy. And he had sort of 4 arguments. One is that I kind of boil them down into one. The one, I'll give you the 4, and you can see whether I'm doing this injustice. I boil this down into one, which is, if you think about what people are doing and what they want to do, that's going to give you a certain objective or a certain direction. If you think about what conservation needs, that's a different objective. These objectives don't always align. So if you get too much sucked into this, how do you know that you're actually conserving nature, protecting the environment? Okay, I'll give you the 4 now, so you don't have to be subject to my reductionist viewpoint on this. It's a good thing I wasn't a systematist in biology. We'd probably have, like 1 family. But, so his arguments were, first of all, nature is not always benevolent. What is best for people may not be what is most natural, or best for nature, if you will. Second argument, market volatility. Shifting prices is not a basis for long-term conservation. So people may want it now, but what if they don't want it 5 years from now? And if they don't want it 5 years from now, maybe we cut down the rainforest, But then our generations coming 20 or 100 years from now, maybe they would not want us to have made that irreversible decision. Okay? A third outcome, technology finds substitutes for nature. So there was the Pacific yew tree, which was gave off, there was a material called Taxol, which was good for fighting certain forms of cancer. It gave a reason to conserve yew trees and the environments in which, forests in which yew trees grew. But, you know, easy come, easy go. We could find a substitute, sort of technological way of making Taxol or other substitute drugs, and then we wouldn't need nature to provide it. Okay? And then the final one was goals of promoting conservation and making profit are often mutually exclusive. Okay, so you can see, I think, why I said sometimes these go in different directions. I will give you two more arguments, and then I'm gonna wrap up. Two more arguments, kind of against. So the first two arguments were from the conservation biology, or kind of from biology point of view in a way. These ones are coming not from biology, but really from society and the view of markets relative to civil society and governance. So this was a blog from The Guardian from the summer. Put a price on nature, we must stop this neoliberal road to ruin. Okay, so the argument here essentially is that this is an extension of markets and kind of neoliberal ideology, that markets are the solution to our problems. And he's saying the blog was saying, we've proven this wrong in other places. There are lots of problems with markets. He in particular does not like market-oriented solutions. He said, we can't, this is just putting more things into the categories of markets when we know that there are big problems. So this is what he's saying, this is kind of the road to ruin. We're expanding kind of the destruction that markets and market ideology will cause. Okay. There's one last one that I want to, and there are others obviously, but the ones that I want to talk about. And I actually myself am quite sympathetic to this. If you haven't read this book, I'd really recommend it. It's What Money Can't Buy: The Moral Limits of Markets by Michael Sandel, who's a political scientist at Harvard. He's also written this book called Justice and a lot of other things. He makes a really interesting point, which I think is backed up from psychology and other places, which is when you start to put things into market terms, you know, I'm going to buy this and sell this, I'm going to trade with you, it's sort of impersonal, take it out of the personal or emotional realm, we think about things differently. So the framing of putting something into a market as a market transaction changes how we think about that. Okay? And if we change how we think about that, you can get different outcomes. Okay, so it's a really profound point and something that I find troubling. So if in the way of studying this or framing this, so oftentimes I will hear myself in the past or my other economists say, well, this is, you know, we're just putting it into this, and that's kind of like, that's innocuous. That's not changing anything. But it might. And in fact, there's good evidence that it does. So in this area, when we're dealing with conservation of other species, biodiversity, when we're dealing with the environment, having clean air and clean water for people, there is inextricably an ethical component of that. And are we changing that ethical component when we say, oh, we should have payments for ecosystem services? We should extend markets into the environment space. So as I say, I find that a really interesting and compelling idea. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, because I haven't sort of fully processed what does that mean for this arguments about valuing nature. I'll give you some thoughts on that. So coming back to the initial title of the talk, should we put a price on nature? I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are some legitimate questions here. And in particular, I haven't gotten into the weeds of how economists actually do valuation in monetary terms, but as you might imagine, that's kind of a lightning rod. It gets lots of attention. Maybe it got you here today, I don't know. But I feel like the question about valuing nature actually is much more than economic valuation, or putting things into dollar terms, although that's what gets 90% of the attention and of the criticism. So what do I mean by, when I said this last thing, it's only part of the story? What I mean by this is follows. I do economics, or I do the economics and ecology for one simple reason. I'm really interested in the decisions that people actually make, and in particular how the decisions that they make affect ecosystems, or more generally the natural world, and ultimately how that feeds back into well-being, benefits and costs, or how people are doing. Okay, so it's that as I said, I'm really interested in getting the best information so that we make decisions, so that we actually have decisions that positively affect societies, positively affect human well-being. I put this up for the following reason. So valuation is just one step here. It's like, I'm perfectly happy to stop here, thinking about ecosystem services, thinking about what are the benefits that people get from nature, and in a sense valuing these in biophysical terms. How many tons of carbon did you have? How much water quality improvement did you get? Right? What are the health impacts of something? So I'm happy to think about that. I'm also happy, and in some instances, it's important to do the valuation to put things into, quote, a common currency. So we can think about how do we weigh these things up. Economists will talk about, let's make the decision that gets us the maximum net benefits or economic efficiency. But sometimes that step, this, quote, valuation or putting things into dollar terms, hides things more than illuminates things. It is more of a controversy than help. There are other cases where it's absolutely essential. If I go into a corporate boardroom, for example, and I say, well, this is nice, and they say, well, but we're interested in the bottom line effects on the company. I need to know how this is affecting the financial statements of the company. Okay, so valuation in dollar terms or monetary terms is controversial. The other thing that I think gets controversial, and you saw this in the Guardian blog post, right, is wrapping this up, this question about value of nature, with markets for nature, or extending market transactions into the environmental space. So this happens with payments for ecosystem services. This happens with cap and trade. This actually is a picture of the Catskills, where there was a transaction between New York City and various cities and counties and landowners up in the Catskills in order to provide clean drinking water to New York City. You can't see this, but this actually really caught my attention. The sign says, "No entrance for any purpose." So anyway, sometimes private property or those kinds of things will mean that we privilege certain party and not others. So I haven't talked very much about distribution or social returns, but there's certainly some large questions there. This is like one of the last points I wanted to make, which is I also haven't talked explicitly about climate change, but climate change is both helping this discussion along valuing nature. Clearly, it makes the point that humans can affect systems on a large scale, and that is going to come back and have consequences for people. So on that scale, it's really helping. At least in the US, however, as most of you know, it's also really polarizing, and it's difficult to have kind of rational scientific discussions on this topic. Now, outside of the US, that's not so much the case, but so a lot of ecosystem services is kind of getting pulled along with this huge train on climate change, both positively and negatively. I said, sort of the partisan nature of it. I think it hasn't really affected the ecosystem services discussion yet, but it well could. I can kind of see it in a few years as probably heading in that direction. Okay, so those of you who are paying really close attention will notice that I've subtly changed the question here. So the question I started with, or was given, I don't know, Todd, who came up with that, but was, should we put a price tag on nature, which really talks about, in a way, putting this through markets and transactions and monetary value. And there, as I said, I have some questions. I think it's extremely valuable in certain instances, but I don't say blanket that I want to always use this everywhere. I think it's problematic in certain regards. Should we value nature? There, I think the answer, I'm unequivocal, is yes. You have to show, and people in this room or people at the Institute on the Environment, I think, kind of know what the value of nature is. You probably don't have to be convinced. But think about, you know, your crazy uncle when you go to your holiday party. Do the other people outside of this room and outside of people who think about these kinds of issues, do they really understand what the contributions of nature are to their continued well-being? And that's the argument that, to me, is fundamental, and that's the one that ultimately I think we need to push along. And with that, I will stop and take questions and hopefully have a good discussion. So thanks very much. I'll be brief because then I want to open up. But you raise a really good point, and I often wrestle with this. You know, the Sandel point that I talked about, which is, you know, if you bring this into the space, so there's a tactics and then there's sort of a longer term strategy question. So the only thing, I completely agree with you. I mean, there's oftentimes where I've been talking like with corporations or government agencies for that matter, and if you can make a very clear monetary argument, like, look, if you don't do this, you know, here are the kinds of risks that are posed to this, here are the kinds of increased costs that you will face, it just cuts through. So I completely agree with you on the value in terms of speed. And then the only question I would have, being an academic, I'm never speedy on anything, but the only question I would have, really, to my mind, is the sort of Sandel longer-term argument about how are we changing the nature of the debate. And so we need to always keep that in the back of your mind. I mean, you know, in a way, it's a variant of the climate change argument. Like, well, we don't really want to go there because climate change, if we really take it seriously, means that we might have to like regulate or have government action. So we'll just deny climate change. I mean, I think for me, okay, so sometimes being as an economist and an ecologist is difficult sometimes, although frankly not, especially not around here. But this one to me, it's like, I don't see how you could make that argument if you're an intelligent person. It's like, just because something goes through a market, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that has value. I mean, clearly clean air and clean water and aesthetics and other things, those things matter. It's just that we don't have the set of institutions that capture those through the marketplace. So as an economist, I feel like on totally solid ground for saying, market values are not total values. There are things called non-market values, and it's a question of institutions and what we have that flows either through markets or not through markets. But just because it doesn't flow through markets doesn't mean it does not have value. And I know you know this, but it would seem to me to be an extremely difficult argument to just say, well, like with the coal plant, you know, the producing coal has value. I mean, electricity has value, and yes, we know that, and all. But you know, avoiding health consequences, having fewer people die from, you know, heart and lung diseases has great value. And so, you know, it's like, anyway, I would be incredulous to find some. I haven't seen anybody make that argument seriously. Most people actually, even, you know, so like in the corporate world, most of the people that I deal with in the corporate world right now are not, we get this. We want to know how to do this in a credible way. We want to have a way of bringing these numbers in a way which is equivalent to, or the certainty that we have on the financial side. So if you want us to bring this in on the financial for us to consider this as a financial argument, then it has to have sort of equal credibility with the other things that come in on our friends. But most of the people I've met are not like saying, "Oh, this is crazy talk," and whatever. Sorry, I just realized I have heard this argument, which is the market fundamentalism. And the market fundamentalism argument is basically we have a free market. So the set of institutions we have right now and the values that come out of that are not only what are, but what should be. And again, I think that's crazy because markets are institutions, and we have a certain set of institutions, and all institutions, just like people, are flawed. So what is not what ought. And so there's a lot of things. Anyway, I think that's an argument that's easily dispensed with. Yeah, no, it's Adam, it's an excellent question, and it gets to one, unfortunately, sort of a little bit outside of my realm. I'm sure there are other people who are better able to answer it, which is, what's the sort of relative power of different things, and you just have to look at the political election cycle and see who's pouring. Anyway, there are. It's not necessarily a balanced fight. The thing which I'm actually most hopeful on in this is, if you divide society into, like there's the public sector and there's the private sector, corporate sector. I mean, there is as much variation in the corporate sector and within particular industries within the corporate sector as there is across these different groups. So it's not universally like all companies don't get this or wouldn't want to go there. Many of the people who I talk to, now it may be a biased sample within these companies, I grant you that. But in answer to Peter's question, they're willing to do this, and they would be really happy to do this if we actually had the goods. In other words, we could actually deliver credible answers on what the value of natural capital is in ways that they would find believable and scientific and so forth. And I think the other concern that would be raised that they would have is, would all of my competitors have to live by the same rules? But I think if you can satisfy at least part of the progressive corporate community on those scores, you can make a lot of progress. And then this comes back to Mark Tursik's argument. It's like, you're never, like, if you really take like the old conservation school approach, and I'll put this in my own, I won't blame Mark for this, but the point is, if you're just immediately going to corporations and say, you guys are the despoilers of nature, you're evil, and we don't want to work with you, then you're locking in that unequal power. So Mark would say, I know what he would say, is like, we need to work with these groups. There's actually a fair amount of common ground, not perfect common ground, but where there is common ground, we need to work with them and bring them along. But it's a really good point, and I don't, yeah. So on that last point, I hope I was clear in the sense of, you may be saying pricing. I'm going to go back to the more basic term of valuing. Because to me, prices are actually more related to markets than values necessarily are. So to me, there's a fundamental concern here about properly showing the value of nature. And value meaning, in this case, typically to human well-being. You can put value to other species, but the arguments here are really to human, how do they affect human well-being? That, you're right, you can separate that from markets. I mean, we can have other sets of institutions. We have government regulations. We have civil society that makes decisions and influences these choices and makes them on values, which are not necessarily going through markets. So I completely agree with that point. The first point that you were making, I mean, I think in a way I think there's sort of a natural progression. You're exactly right that economics, and specifically macroeconomics, when they talk about kind of the grand scale of what are the resources that society has to work with, it was land, labor, and capital throughout the whole classical period. And at some point in the early 20th century, it got collapsed to labor and capital. So, you know, if you really go back, and there are lots of people actually within the economics profession who now put in, you know, climate or have climate as one thing, or will have resource use or pollution as another factor. So there are examples, but the kind of textbook story would be capital and labor. And, you know, if you thought, I mean, I'm willing to give my 19th century forebears a little bit of benefit here in the sense of they were small relative to the size of nature. Now we have no excuse. We're big. There's no ignoring what impact that we have. So nature and natural capital are scarce. Well, economists deal with scarcity. I mean, that is kind of the reason for the whole profession, at least the last I looked. So we ought to be taking natural capital and scarcity and ecosystem services really seriously. Some of us are doing this. Jay, you're helping out on this, Jay Coggin. But, you know, I think critics of the economics profession are somewhat justified in saying the mainstream of the profession, the bulk of the profession, has not woken up to the importance of this issue. That's a really good question, and I can't come up with it. I won't do the thing. I always hate when people say it depends, but but that's such a. I mean, I can point to instances where having it owned by one entity actually has led to conservation. So, for example, some of you, if you've ever been out in western Wyoming and the Grand Tetons, I mean, that was a lot of the land which is now Grand Teton National Park was Rockefeller land. You know, they bought it up, they set it aside, and because of their actions, you know, we have a national park. So there's an example. I'll give you another example. This actually is coming from the public sphere, but it's kind of the same principle. So the largest intact coastal sage community in California is owned by the Defense Department. It's Camp Pendleton. You know, it's the only large natural area between San Diego and Los Angeles, and you know that would not have been there had not the Camp Pendleton been there. So there are examples of it, but certainly there are examples that go the other way. I mean, you know, we see oftentimes private ownership, especially if it's kind of interested in a short turnaround of the profits. So one of the real difficulties right now in the timber industry are companies that come in and buy up, this ownership of a company to literally strip the timber and, you know, turn a quick profit and sell it off again and go do that somewhere else. Another company I know of is very worried about the corporate raiders who have a very short-term focus, and they were telling me, it's like, you know, I don't know how much to believe this, like, we're interested in we want to do the right thing, we want to have a long-term vision, but it's these guys over here who are forcing our hand, and we have to do actions in the short term to pump up our stock price. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, I don't see that. I don't see that private ownership is necessarily the villain or the answer in terms of this particular question. And there are lots of other dimensions on which one could think about whether private ownership is the right or the wrong thing. You know, like that sign that I had up on the Catskills Reservoir that said "Keep out." You know, what is the right of all of us to, like in Sweden, there's the right to roam. You know, do we have that, or is it really, you know, in this country, more often you just see no trespassing signs. So. Excellent question. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really hard here is we might be able to do a pretty good job of thinking about what the trade-offs are now or 5 years from now or whatever. But what about how the action that we take, which starts the system on a different trajectory, and ultimately where does it head, especially in complicated systems? I mean, if you come up with that answer, more power to you. I mean, it's a really good question, and one we don't have a good answer to. But you did raise one, which is precautionary principle. So the way I like to think about these questions is all actions that we take set us on a trajectory, but we don't know exactly what it is. So we actually have some type of probability distribution. We try to provide the best evidence we have on the probability distribution and how our actions would shift those probability distributions. There is the precautionary principle within economics. There's a very related concept. I think multiple fields have discovered this at different times. This thing called option value, which is the value to avoiding irreversible decisions while there is uncertainty. So if you're closing off options, so the classic application in land use or in economics was, suppose that you have a decision about whether to maintain a forest or to cut it down, or turn it into a shopping center. And it's pretty difficult to go back. We'll call that irreversible. Okay? So if that's true, and you don't know how valuable the forest will be in the future, for that matter, the shopping mall, what you might do is you don't just make that decision on the basis of a cost-benefit, well, what are my expected costs and the benefits of future spending? You say, no, I'm going to actually place an additional option value. I'm keeping open the option to make that decision into the future. Precautionary principle is sort of the same thing. If you don't know something, you might want to put kind of added burden of proof on people who are posing risky options on society. It's an excellent point. Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's part of the reason why, and if you've got suggestions for the simple tagline, I found that the power of a simple example or the simple number like that health and environment study, we got attention for that because we said, look, here's a simple chain of logic, and you come up with very large costs associated with certain types of electricity generation. So, yes, thank you. Oh yeah, there's lots of trade-offs in nature. If you grow more forests and have less grassland, that's good for forest species and not for grassland species, as you might imagine. So, but coming back to some of your other points, the value of life question is a particularly good one, and it's not separate, frankly, from the value of nature or the environment, because the health and environment costs of electricity generation, for example, I just talked about. I mean, how did we get numbers for what the cost associated with electricity generation was? If it's health, it's a value of life question, right? So, we could punt it and say, well, EPA said it was this, but fundamentally, you have to come back to the question about what are those trade-offs. Can you do this without explicitly putting a price tag on it? Yes. In fact, in the health arena, I mean, if it were up to me, but actually, maybe you've thought about this more deeply. I find it more powerful to say, if you build this coal plant or you run the electricity generation in this way, we think that is going to lead to 2,000 premature deaths through, heart and breathing disorder, right? 2,000, or do you want to multiply that, by 7 million per statistical life and come up with a big dollar value? Which do you think is the most? I think when you're in the human life arena, the 2,000 lives is a very powerful statement, and so I don't feel the need necessarily to put that in dollar terms. there are people, in fact, who have made that, you know, if you put this environmental regulation on, it's going to cause people to be less, you know, have lower income, and when they have lower income, they have higher health. I mean, I think actually that's just a question of fully tracing through all the costs and benefits, even when they're sometimes uncomfortable. But whether you want to report that ultimately, I mean, ultimately, you know, if we're talking about health consequences versus some other category, the question is, how do you make those trade-offs? Do you just say, oh, it's a health consequence versus a, you know, a resource consequence, or do you try to put them all into the same metric? And I frankly come back to the kind of point you raised, is what's most helpful in communicating this to the decision maker? So.
Great. Well, this was a wonderful discussion today. I want to thank all of you, but let's thank our speaker today, Professor.